I entered the courthouse the way I had entered so many other places in my life, with posture, focus, and no room for error. My heels echoed against the polished marble like a warning, not to anyone else but to myself. I took a deep breath. It was just another case. Or so I believed. There was always something ceremonial about that space. Dark wood, motionless flags, the invisible weight of decisions that altered lives without ever raising their voice. I liked that. The order, the predictability, the fact that, inside those walls, everything obeyed clear rules. Until she walked in. The judge wasn't seated yet when I lifted my eyes for the first time. And that was all it took. One single, poorly calculated moment of attention. And something inside me shifted. Subtle. Irreversible. Isadora Fontenelle. Her name traveled through the room before her presence did. But her presence didn't announce itself. It imposed itself. She walked with a confidence that asked no permission. Robe perfectly tailored. Hair pulled back with almost cruel precision. An expression too serene to be merely professional. Silence followed her path. Not only out of institutional respect, but because some people carry their own gravity. And Isadora carried it. I sat straighter, crossing my legs with calculated care. Opened my folder. Aligned the pages. Did everything I always do when I need to remember who I am. Lawyer. Prepared. Immune. Still I felt it. It wasn't immediate desire. Not the kind you recognize easily. It was something far more dangerous. Absolute attention. When her eyes met mine there was no surprise. There was a pause. A fraction of a second. Too brief to be noticed by anyone else. Too long to be irrelevant to me. She assessed me the way someone reads between the lines. And for the first time in years, I forgot the next sentence of my own argument. The hearing began. Voices rose. Rituals unfolded. You spoke. Argued. I was precise. Technical. Brilliant by my own standards. Yet every word felt charged with something new. As if it were being heard by someone who saw beyond the thesis, beyond the case, beyond the armor I wore every day. Isadora listened, face impassive. But I noticed. The way her fingers rested on the bench. The slight tilt of her head. The attention that never wavered. That wasn't flirting. It was worse. It was recognition. When the hearing was adjourned, I stood with the same composure I'd entered with. But inside, something had been displaced from its exact, familiar place. Passed her on my way out. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. The courthouse remained the same. The laws too. But I didn't. And as I walked toward the exit, a silent certainty formed, clear as a verdict not yet read aloud. Neither of us would leave unscathed. By the second hearing I wasn't lying to myself anymore. I arrived earlier than necessary. Not out of strategy. I'd never needed that. But because there was a restlessness in me I couldn't arrange any other way. I sat in the first row reserved for counsel and kept my folder closed on my lap, as if delaying contact with the paperwork could somehow delay the inevitable. Isadora entered on time. Always on time. The courtroom reacted like a trained body. Everyone rose, chairs scraping in unison, heads bowing with practiced respect. I followed the motion, but my eyes lingered a second longer than protocol allowed. She looked different. Or maybe I did. Her hair was pulled back flawlessly, not a strand out of place. The robe fell over her with austere elegance, nearly severe. But there was something beneath the surface, something no school of magistrates could teach. Absolute self-control. Isadora didn't need to enforce authority. She simply was obeyed. When she sat, she folded her hands with calm precision, as if every movement had been rehearsed. Not to please anyone, but to reveal nothing. Her face was serene but not distant. Too intelligent to be neutral. And then her eyes found me. Not immediately. She scanned the room with the technical gaze of someone who reads the whole before focusing on the detail. But when she reached me she stopped. No expression. No smile. No indulgence. And that was what hit me. She wasn't looking at me as a woman. Not yet. She was looking at me as an equal. As someone worthy of full attention. When I began to speak, I felt the difference. My voice was steady as always. The argument sharp. But there was a subtext that wasn't in the record. A quiet tension that crossed the space between us. Every time I lifted my eyes to confirm she was following my reasoning, she was there, attentive in a way that felt deliberate. Isadora listened like someone decoding. She didn't interrupt unnecessarily. She didn't show impatience. But she didn't make it easy either. Her questions were precise, surgical, forcing me beyond the obvious. And I liked it more than I should have. It was an elegant duel. Words instead of touch. Pauses instead of sighs. When she granted my request in part, I felt something I had never associated with judicial decisions. Private satisfaction. Not because I'd won. That was routine. But because I'd been understood. During the break I stood to get water. That was when I heard her voice outside the formal ritual. Attorney Valentina. My name said like that had physical weight. Turned slowly. She was standing a few steps behind me without the robe. A light blazer outlined her waist with quiet sobriety, and without the symbol of office, the woman in her became even more forceful. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my posture. She inclined her head slightly, a minimal gesture, almost imperceptible. Her eyes, however, didn't retreat. "Your argument about proximate cause was interesting." Interesting. Not an open compliment. Not a critique. A door left unlatched. "I'm glad you considered it," I replied, feeling an excessive care with each word. Isadora held the silence a moment longer than it needed to exist, and then said softly, "Not always the best arguments are in the record." There was something there, and we both knew it. She walked away before I could answer. No farewell. No conclusion. I stood frozen, the paper cup forgotten in my hand, feeling the delayed impact of that brief contact. There was no touch, no promise, only confirmation, quiet and absolute, that something was moving beyond institutional control. That day, I understood something fundamental. Isadora Fontanelle wasn't an obvious temptation. She was a risk too carefully calculated to ignore. And the most dangerous part. She knew exactly what she was doing. The case was complicated enough to require multiple hearings. Parties unwilling to yield, intersecting interests, documents unfolding into opposing interpretations. Under different circumstances, I would have enjoyed the challenge purely for what it demanded technically. But there was Isadora. Each newly scheduled date was a silent reminder that I'd return to the one place where my logic faltered for reasons that had nothing to do with the law. I began to recognize the courthouse's rhythm not by the clock, but by her presence. By the almost physical expectation that came before her entrance. At the third hearing I noticed something different. Isadora began watching me before I spoke. Not with curiosity, with anticipation. As if she knew exactly when I'd stand, when I'd change my tone, when I'd press the vulnerable seam in the other side's position. And I started responding to it. My arguments gained a precision that felt almost provocative. I tested limits, not of the law but of her. I introduced nuance, left calculated openings like someone asking a question without putting it into words. She accepted the game. "Attorney Valentina," she said at one point, interrupting me with firm gentleness. "Could you elaborate on that?" The request came with a direct look, held just long enough to be non-neutral. The silence that followed was total. Everyone waited. I let a small smile form. Not for the room. For her. "With pleasure, Your Honor." And I elaborated. While I spoke, I felt something rare. Being challenged by someone who didn't need to prove anything. Isadora didn't compete for power. She possessed it. And still, she granted me space, as if watching to see whether I knew how to occupy it. When the hearing ended, I stayed seated for a few seconds longer than necessary, organizing my papers with exaggerated calm. I knew she'd leave first. She always did. But that day she didn't. "Attorney," she called again. I stood, inhaling before turning. "Yes." She stepped closer, close enough for privacy, not intimacy. The exact distance where everything can be denied later. "I'd like to clarify a point before the next hearing," she said, voice low, controlled. "If you're available." Available. It wasn't a formal request. It wasn't a directive. It was an opening. "Of course," I said without hesitation. She nodded, satisfied, and wrote something down quickly. Then looked up again. "Tomorrow. After hours." She didn't ask. She stated. When she walked away, the delayed impact hit. This wasn't recklessness. It was intention. Careful, deliberate, dangerous. That night, I reviewed the case like someone reviewing an entire life. Each argument seemed to carry another layer. Each decision felt like a choice reaching far beyond the file. I wondered if Isadora did this with other attorneys. If that technical interest, if that was all it was, repeated itself. The answer came too easily. Oh, there was something specific between us. Silent alignment. Mutual recognition that required no explanation. The next day I arrived early again. They led me to a smaller reserved room, away from the main courtroom. When Isadora entered, she closed the door calmly. No robe. No audience. No shields. For a second neither of us spoke. Alone, the silence had a different density. "Thank you for coming," she said finally. "I would have come," I replied. Only then did I hear the weight of what I'd said. Isadora's eyes held mine long enough for the air between us to change. There was no courthouse anymore. No case. Just two women measuring the distance between what was allowed and what was already slipping out of control. And in that moment, something struck me with uncomfortable clarity. The case wasn't what kept us close anymore. It was just the excuse. The room was too small for two women who had learned to occupy larger spaces. Isadora remained standing for a few seconds after closing the door. I did too. Neither of us seemed willing to be the first to sit, as if that simple gesture would decide who would lead what came next. "This point in the case," she began at last, turning toward the table, "requires special care." Her voice was the same as in court. Technical. Controlled. But here, without witnesses, control came at a cost. I could hear her breathing with too much clarity. "I agree," I said, stepping closer. "It's exactly where interpretation can change everything." She nodded but didn't open the file. Instead, she braced her hands on the table and lifted her eyes to me. Direct, clear, and hurried. "You tend to be bold in your readings, Attorney Valentina." The full use of my name tightened something in my chest. "Boldness is also a form of rigor," I answered, my body too aware of her proximity. "The safest route isn't always the most just." Isadora tilted her head slightly, studying me like someone evaluating something rare. Silence stretched, heavy, charged with what words could no longer hold. "I noticed that," she said. "From the first hearing." There was no accusation in her tone. No praise. Just fact. I moved to the opposite side of the table, opening my folder with movements too precise. I needed something solid between us, a page, a line of text, anything that reminded me why we were there. "If we look at this section," I pointed, "it's clear the case law allows another interpretation." Isadora stepped in to read. Too close. Her perfume was discreet but present, something sober, elegant, impossible to ignore. I felt her arm brush mine. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an advance either. It was a test. Neither of us moved away. "You know," Isadora said, voice low, "there are lines that shouldn't be crossed." I swallowed. Not because I disagreed, because I knew exactly what lines she meant. "I know," I said. "But I also know some lines exist only because no one had the courage to question them." She turned her face slowly toward mine. We were close enough that the air between us felt insufficient. "And do you usually question everything?" she asked. I smiled, small, contained. "Dangerous. Only what's worth it." Isadora's gaze darkened, not with anger, recognition. For an instant, I was certain she was about to say something that would change everything. Or do something. Or touch me. But Isadora Fontenelle wasn't impulsive. She stepped back first. "That will be enough for today," she said, retrieving professional distance with almost painful precision. I appreciate your availability. Availability. The word vibrated in the air like it meant far more than time on a calendar. Always, I replied. When I walked out, my legs needed a few steps to remember how to move normally. Nothing had happened that could be documented. No formal breach. No ethical violation. And still, everything had changed. Because now I knew. Isadora Fontanelle didn't just perceive what was between us. She sustained it. And looks like that don't respect codes, or titles, or courtrooms. I always knew how to recognize risk. In law, it shows up early. A poorly built argument, an emotional reaction at the wrong time, too much confidence. I'd always identified the danger before it became a problem. With Isadora it was different. The first real warning didn't come in court. It came at home, in the silence of my apartment. That night, I sat on the couch with a book open in my hands and read none of it. The wine stayed untouched. My body was there, but my attention kept returning to somewhere else. That small room. That almost touch. That look that never apologized. I realized I was rehearsing answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. Imagining how she'd react to certain ideas. To certain gestures. To me. 'Twas new. And profoundly unsettling. At the next hearing, I made a mistake too small for anyone else to notice. Except me. I spoke too quickly. I didn't lose control. I didn't compromise the argument. But I rushed a section I normally would have handled slowly. As if part of me wanted to finish quickly. Or maybe to stretch the moment indefinitely. Isadora noticed. Her eyes narrowed for the briefest second. A near-invisible shift in posture. She didn't interrupt. Let me continue. But when I sat down, I felt her gaze land on me like a question without shape. During the break, I went to the upstairs bathroom, the one hardly anyone used. I braced my hands against the marble sink and stared at my reflection. I was flawless on the outside. But my eyes gave away something I didn't recognize easily. Anticipation. Focus, I whispered. But my body didn't obey. When I returned, Isadora was already seated. As I approached, she spoke without raising her voice. Attorney Valentina. A moment. My stomach tightened. I followed her to a side corridor, away from the main flow. There, the courthouse lost some of its solemnity. It became just a building, too big to contain what was about to happen. You seem distracted today, she said with trained neutrality. Distracted. No criticism could have been more accurate. I disagree, I replied automatically. I'm fully attentive to the case. Isadora leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate but to close distance. That wasn't what I asked. Silence dropped between us. Did something happen? She added softer. That question belonged to no protocol. No, I answered too fast. She held my gaze. I held hers. Neither of us blinked first. The air thickened, as if the space itself was learning how to contain tension. Good, Isadora said at last, stepping back. Because I need your best version in this case. Your best version. Not the best attorney. The best woman I could be there. You'll have it, I said. But as she walked away, I knew that promise was no longer entirely honest. In the days that followed, I realized how much Isadora had seeped into my most ordinary gestures. I adjusted my posture as if she were watching, chose words with excessive care, reconsidered decisions I used to make on instinct. Worse, I started wanting to be seen not as an attorney but as a woman by someone who should never have looked at me that way. And when that happens, the professional doesn't collapse all at once. Cracks, a discreet fissure, manageable, until it isn't. I was still standing, still impeccable, still respected. But something in me had crossed an invisible line. And I knew it. It wouldn't be possible to come out of this hole again. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no scandal, no loss of control. The first boundary break came the way everything between us did. Precisely. It was after the longest hearing so far. Hours of tension, exhaustive arguments, postponed decisions. When the courtroom emptied, I felt a different kind of exhaustion. Not physical, but alert, overstimulated. I was organizing my papers when I heard footsteps behind me. Attorney Valentina turned slowly. Isadora stood there without her robe, her expression too neutral for the late hour. "I need a few clarifications," she said. "If you still have a moment." I had all the moments in the world. And that terrified me. We walked to the same reserved room. The door closed with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in my chest like confirmation. Isadora walked to the window, looking down at the city below. The courthouse at night had a different personality. Less solemn, more exposed. "This case has demanded more from me than I expected," she said without turning. That wasn't technical language. It was a confession. "From me as well," I answered. She finally turned. Her eyes met mine without mediation. No robe. No formality. Just two women holding a truth that had been growing between the pauses. "Do you trust your own judgment?" she asked. Smiled barely. "I always have. Even when it points to something inconvenient." The silence that followed was the most honest one we had ever shared. "Especially then," I said. Isadora took one step toward me. Just one. Enough for me to feel her presence as something physical, undeniable. My body reacted before my mind. Focused, warm, ready in a way I didn't remember ever feeling like this. "Valentina," she said my name for the first time without a title. That was the line. Not the touch. Not the kiss. Name. The world narrowed to the small space between us. I could have stepped back. Said something technical. Rebuilt the wall. I didn't. "Isadora," I replied. She closed her eyes for a second. Too brief to be accidental. When she opened them there was decision there. Not recklessness. "This is a mistake," she said softly close. "I know. It shouldn't happen," she added. "I know that too," I answered. Neither of us moved for a long, unbearable moment. Then slowly, almost cruelly, Isadora lifted her hand and touched my wrist. That was all. Nothing explicit. Nothing that could be accused. But enough for my entire body to respond as if it had been called by its true name. Her hand was warm, firm, too steady to be hesitant. "Tell me to stop," she whispered. I looked at her, feeling the final line approaching. "Don't." Her touch slid from my wrist to my palm. Our fingers intertwined with a naturalness that betrayed how long this had been happening in silence. There was no kiss. Not yet. Isadora released my hand first. Always aware of the risk. Always trying to remain in control. "This doesn't change anything," she said, as if convincing herself. "It changes everything," I replied. She held my gaze for a long second, then stepped away. "We need to be careful." "I always am," I said. "But I don't retreat from what I begin." Isadora smiled slightly. Rare smile. Too intimate for a courtroom. "I've noticed. When I left that room I knew. The boundary had been crossed. Not with the body, but with enough intention to make pretending impossible. Desire now had memory. And once it learns the path, it doesn't respect borders. After that touch nothing was innocent anymore. We didn't speak for 2 full days. No messages. No attempts at contact beyond what was strictly necessary. In court, we kept the precise distance protocol demanded, and desire despised. It was a silent agreement. But silence is not absence. It's accumulation. I felt Isadora before I saw her. My body learned the courthouse's rhythm through the cadence of her presence. When she entered the room, something in me adjusted automatically. Posture, breathing, focus. As if I were being summoned to a place I had never occupied before. And she watched me like someone guarding something too precious to touch in public. Our encounters moved to the margins. An emptier corridor. An elevator just about to reach the ground floor. A glance too quick to be noticed. Too long to be denied. We never touched where anyone could see. But desire found other ways to exist. rulings with unnecessary phrases, calculated pauses when saying my name. The way Isadora held my gaze 1 second longer before closing a hearing carried all of it home. Lying in bed, I replayed every detail like someone revisiting a forbidden scene. The sound of her voice saying, "Valentina," the contained firmness, her warm hand holding mine for an instant that should never have existed, but did. And I wanted more. Not of the touch, of the presence. The first time we met outside the courthouse wasn't planned as a meeting. It was necessity disguised as coincidence. Legal event, neutral setting, familiar faces. Enough to not raise suspicion. When I arrived, Isadora was already there, speaking with 2 colleagues. Impeccable, distant, untouchable. Until she saw me. The smile was minimal, almost non-existent. But her eyes betrayed everything. We spoke in a group. About case law, reforms, numbers. But the real dialogue happened beneath the surface. Every sentence carried a second meaning. Every pause a promise. At some point, Isadora stepped away to take a call. Minutes later my phone vibrated. Side corridor. Now. My heart raced. I looked around. No one noticed. I walked calmly, rehearsed, as if heading to the restroom. The corridor was empty. Isadora waited by the window. When I approached, she didn't speak. She simply closed the distance between us with one decisive step. "We can't keep doing this," she said, low and urgent. "Doing what?" I asked, knowing exactly. "Pretending it's not happening." My body was far too alert for pretending. "Then stop," I challenged softly. She let out a brief, tense laugh. "I don't want to." The words fell between us like an agreement signed without reading the fine print. Isadora touched my arm. Then my waist. Nothing rushed. Nothing out of control. Every gesture measured. To not cross and yet cross every boundary. "This has to stay between us," she said. "Completely." "It always has," I answered. She pulled me just enough for our bodies to align. Faces close. Breaths mingling. The kiss came without hurry, but without doubt. Contained. A kiss that didn't ask permission because it had already been granted in silence many times. When we pulled back, the world felt unstable. "It's dangerous," she murmured. "Everything that matters is," I replied. From that day on, we lived in 2 realities. In court we were impeccable. Outside it, we were restrained urgency. We met at improbable hours. Discreet places. Always careful. Always hungry. Desire wasn't explosion, it was construction. Each encounter made us more aware of the risk. And more willing to take it. But secrets charge interest. And I knew. The more silence we accumulated, the louder the sound would be when everything came out. Desire, once it stops being fantasy, demands position. Until then, Isadora and I lived in compartments. The courthouse was one. Our encounters another. I had always been good at separating, maintaining versions of myself without letting them touch. But there was a problem. I had never divided my body before. I started feeling the weight of it in small moments. Call interrupted late at night. An institutional email signed by her. Too cold for someone who knew the heat of her mouth. The way my name, spoken in public, was no longer enough to contain what it carried in private. Isadora felt it too. Could see it. In court, her control had become tighter. Her decisions more careful. She avoided looking at me for too long. And when she did, it was with the intensity of someone holding on by an invisible thread. One rainy afternoon, after a particularly tense hearing, she called me again. Not to the reserved room. We walked side by side to a discreet cafe 2 blocks from the courthouse. No intimate gestures. No suspicious closeness. Just 2 women too tired to fake normalcy. We sat at separate tables, as if by chance. When the place emptied, she moved closer. "This is getting harder," she said bluntly. "Hard was never the problem," I replied. "I've always handled that well." She smiled without humor. "Don't lie to me, Valentina. Not now." The way she said my name, without restraint, without care, tightened my chest. "What do you want me to say?" I asked. Isadora rested her elbows on the table. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked tired. "I want to know how far you're willing to go." It wasn't a romantic question. It was structural. "And you?" asked back. She looked away for a second. "Just one. I have more to lose." That hurt more than I expected. "We all do," I said. "The difference is what we choose to lose first." Isadora breathed in deeply. When she looked back at me, there was something new there. Fear. Not of scandal. Of truth. "If this comes out," she began, "it won't end well," I finished. "For either of us." We fell silent. The coffee cooled. Rain streaked down the glass, distorting the city outside as if mirroring exactly what was happening inside us. "I've never been impulsive," she said. "I built everything with precision. Every step." "I know," I replied. "That's why you're here, trying to measure something that doesn't fit on any ruler." She closed her eyes briefly. "This isn't just desire. It never was." The realization landed between us. Irreversible. I didn't want Isadora only in the dark, in stolen moments on the margins. I wanted her whole. And that meant demanding decisions that could no longer be postponed. "I won't be a comfortable secret," I said, firm, not aggressive. "Not for you. Not for anyone." Isadora looked at me for a long time. For the first time, I didn't see control. I saw conflict. "And if I'm not capable of choosing yet?" she asked, almost whispering. The answer crossed me before it fully formed. "Then the choice is already being made," I said. She understood. We stood without touching. Outside, each of us walked in a different direction down the street. It wasn't goodbye. It was suspension. As I walked, I felt the real weight of what we'd built. It wasn't just desire anymore. It was a life project. And projects demand clear decisions. Or they collapse. That night, alone, I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. Love doesn't ask permission. But it demands courage. And very soon, one of us would have to prove it. The final hearing arrived with the solemnity of an ending no one announces, but everyone senses. The case was ready. The parties exhausted. The courtroom unusually quiet. For any other matter, it would have been just the technical closure of a long dispute. For me, it was the thin line between everything I had been and everything I could become. I entered with my posture intact, folder steady in my hands, face composed. Inside, every step was an emotional calculation. Isadora was already there. She didn't look at me right away. She adjusted her papers with ritual care, as if each movement were an anchor. When she finally raised her eyes, the impact felt like an unwritten sentence. There was farewell there. Not explicit, but final. During the hearing we were impeccable. Perhaps too impeccable. Our exchanges were precise, clean, almost cold. There was no subtext, or maybe there was so much of it that it became invisible to everyone else. As I delivered my final argument, a painful clarity crossed me. This might be the last time I would speak to Isadora Fontenelle from that place. The last time our worlds would touch under the protection of role, formality, institutional justification. When I finished, silence fell. Isadora took a breath before speaking. I recognized the gesture. It was the same one she used in our secret meetings, seconds before saying something that mattered. "I thank the parties," she began, voice firm, "for their technical and respectful conduct throughout this process." She paused briefly. Her eyes traveled the room, but stopped on me for an instant no one else noticed. "The decision will now be rendered." As she read, I didn't hear the words. Sound receded. Time slowed. All that existed was the weight of that woman, that voice, that choice, not only judicial but personal. When she finished, she struck the gavel. "This session is adjourned." The sound echoed like something far too definitive. People stood. Low conversations began. Chairs scraped. I remained seated 1 second longer. So did Isadora. When we finally rose, our eyes met again. There was no restraint left. Only raw truth. She inclined her head slightly. A gesture almost imperceptible. Goodbye said everything. I gathered my papers and walked toward the exit. Each step demanded more than the last. Before reaching the door, I heard her voice one final time. Attorney Valentina. Turned. Yes. The entire courtroom was there. And still that moment belonged only to us. It was a privilege, she said, choosing each word like someone choosing what to leave behind. My throat tightened. I didn't smile. Likewise, Your Honor. There was a final silence. No promises. No request. No touch. I left the courthouse knowing that judgment hadn't ended there. Because now, without the case to keep us close, only the naked truth remained. Either Isadora would choose, or I would choose for both of us. And no sentence would ever be heavier than that. I went 3 days without hearing from Isadora. No message, no call, no indirect sign. Her silence wasn't neglect, it was method. Isadora had always handled difficult decisions this way, isolating herself from noise until only what could no longer be ignored remained. I, on the other hand, felt everything. I felt her absence as a physical weight, as if my body had learned a new language, and was now being deprived of it. For the first time in years, work wasn't enough to distract me. Winning other cases didn't fill the space she left. On the 4th night my phone vibrated. We need to talk. Tonight. If it still makes sense. Did. More than I was willing to admit. The address she sent wasn't the courthouse. Not the discreet cafe. It was her apartment. That alone was a partial answer. I rode the elevator with my heart racing, feeling each floor pull me farther from the woman I had been until then. When the doors opened, Isadora was waiting. No robe, no armor, no defenses. She wore clothes too simple for someone used to being observed. Her hair loose framed a face that looked tired, but resolved. Her eyes met mine like someone finally accepting a truth. "Come in," she said. The apartment was quiet, minimalist, too organized for someone about to dismantle her own life. The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound. "I requested a leave of absence," she said without preamble. The words took a second to settle. "What?" "Temporary," she clarified. "Officially, for exhaustion. Unofficially," she paused, "because I can't keep pretending nothing happened." My chest tightened. "This is serious, Isadora." "Everything about me is," she replied steady. She stepped closer but didn't touch me yet. "I've spent my entire life making safe choices. Ethical ones. Irreproachable ones." Her eyes never left mine. "And still, I've never felt so divided as I do now. Because for the first time you want something that doesn't fit protocol," I said. She nodded slowly. "I want you," she said at last. "No embellishment. No drama. Not as a secret. Not as a margin. Not as a recurring mistake." My heart beat too loudly for immediate answers. "And what does that cost?" "Yes. Everything I can't keep sustaining," she said. "A position that protects me but suffocates me. An image that isn't fully mine. A control that turned into a prison. Those weren't promises. They were renunciations. I don't know where this leads," she continued. "I only know that if I don't choose now, I'll spend the rest of my life judging others for decisions I never had the courage to make." There was fear in her voice, but something greater too, coherence. "I won't ask you for guarantees," I said. "Or safety. Or a fixed future." She inhaled deeply. "Still I choose you." That was it. Not the touch. Not the kiss. The choice spoken aloud. I stepped closer then. Touched her face with the calm of someone who no longer needed to rush. I kissed her without urgency, without guilt, without hiding. Full kiss. Present. Adult. When we parted, Isadora rested her forehead against mine. "This will change everything," she whispered. "I know," I said. "That's why it works." In that moment I understood. It wasn't about losing something. It was about stopping the loss of oneself. And no verdict could ever be more liberating than that. Today, when I look back, I don't think about what we left behind, but about what we finally had the courage to live. The courthouse grew distant. Titles changed. Certainties rearranged themselves. But something essential remained intact. The choice not to abandon ourselves anymore. Not every love is born on easy ground. Some emerge precisely where we were taught to obey, to stay quiet, to follow rules that were never designed for us. And maybe you, listening now, understand exactly what I mean. Maybe there's a desire inside you asking for space. A truth that no longer wants to be postponed. Question that returns whenever everything goes quiet. If this story touched you in any way, even if you're not sure why, stay here with me. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like. It helps this story reach other women who need to hear they're not alone. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing how far these voices travel, how far these stories reach those who need them. Some loves don't ask permission. They ask for courage. And maybe, just maybe, yours is beginning now.